Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is a review of the 1986 cult classic creature feature, Critters. They Bite. Now, before I get into this review, I want to give a very special shout out to a good friend of mine and longtime subscriber, Jonathan, for sending me the Critters films on Blu-ray, as well as requesting this series of reviews. Um, Now, without further ado and without further blabbing, let's get into my thoughts on the film. So, before I get into my in depth thoughts on various different aspects of the film and what I think, I want to not necessarily dispel, but offer a rebuttal to the criticism that Critters is just a Gremlins ripoff. Critters is much more than just a Gremlins ripoff. In fact, Critters isn't even a Gremlins ripoff in the first place. Critters was written before Gremlins was even shot or released. It just didn't get greenlit until after the success of Gremlins. Critters also is a different film in terms of its tone. It's a different film in terms of the way that it deals with things or uh, handles certain situations and elements of the overall story. I would say Critters is a more darker and edgier film than Gremlins is. Like, Critters has the sense of humor, but Gremlins feels like even more of a cartoon in comparison. Gremlins, especially if you look at something like Gremlins 2, and I enjoy Gremlins. I enjoy Gremlins too, but I don't really see why some people have dubbed Critters as just some lazy ripoff of Gremlins. I don't think that's fair to the film. I think it stands out on its own, and I honestly feel that they're two separate films. And it also helps that this was written before Gremlins, so you could maybe make the argument that Gremlins is a ripoff of Critters, but I wouldn't even say that anyway because I don't really buy into the whole ripoff thing in the first place. Various different films and stories are inspired by other stories, and I think that's okay. I don't think that's really a net negative. Now, the film was directed by Stephen Herek, and this is his directorial debut. And honestly, I thought he did a really good job. I thought it was a delectable directing effort by Steven, especially for a first time director. I felt he did a wonderful job with the sequences that are supposed to have a eerie mood or atmosphere. Um, I really liked the choice of having a steady cam or something like it for the POV of the critters. He did a equally as effective job moving the camera around and injecting a lot of life and energy into what was essentially a low budget production. And he worked really well with the film's screenwriter and with his cast and with everyone else involved with the production of the film from a technical standpoint, his cinematographer, the effects guys, the Kyoto brothers, and so on. It's one of those films where it's kind of hard to believe that this is a first time director who did this movie because it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like the work from a established veteran behind the camera. And what's also kind of interesting about Steven is that he got the job due to a coin flip. He and the film's screenwriter, Brian Dominic Muir, were longtime friends and collaborators. They met when they were working together at Roger Corman's film studio, and Brian wrote the screenplay for Critters freehand, and he brought Steven on board to do some rewrites and maybe punch up the dialogue or punch up other parts of the film. And when it came to the film getting ready to be shot, the two of them agreed to a coin flip. If you know how coin flips work. So if it turned up heads or tails, that would lead to either Brian or Steven getting the directing job. Because Brian had done short films prior to his work for Critters, or around the same time. And I think Steven had also done some short films too, but he had not directed a feature film before. And fate would have it that Steven would win the coin toss and he would get the directing job. And he would go on to direct more films after Critters due to the success of the film. So it's just an interesting bit of trivia that Stephen Herek's career was all started or kick-started because of a coin toss. Uh, but yeah, I've always felt that he did a good job directing this film, uh, and it's one of those things where this is a film that easily could have not worked as well as it does. There's a fine line that this film has to create and has to follow in terms of its tone, in terms of its overall setup. This is a film that has to be sufficiently ferocious and dark and genuinely chilling and thrilling, but at the same time be tongue-in-cheek and have a little bit of camp and not take things too seriously, because after all, it's a horror film about a bunch of furry balls from outer space. So you have to find that balance. And it's not an easy balance to find, as you can see with other films in this franchise, in particular, some of the more recent installments in the Critters franchise. But Steven and Brian managed to really find and fine tune that balance. And that's a big reason why this film still has such a big following to this day and still holds up as well as it does, is because of that balance that it manages to achieve. It also helps that Brian and Steven already had a relationship that was strong prior to their collaboration for Critters. There's a lot of instances in film productions where you have screenwriters who have a particular vision, but then a director gets hired and the producers get involved, and the vision is clouded or the vision is completely changed. But that's not the case here. And what's interesting about the vision for Critters is initially Brian, he wrote the film as a darker, gorier, more traditional horror film for the time. And it was definitely more of an R rating. Some of the family members actually even died. But he decided against that once he saw the success of Gremlins, and decided to, well, actually it was before that, I believe, because he just felt that he just wasn't really into the whole gory, more sinister feel to the overall screenplay. So he decided to make some changes along with Steven, and the rest is history. I can't sing enough praises for Brian's screenplay because, like I said, I think it does a really remarkable job with this balance of genuine chills and thrills as well as comedy. And the critters themselves are just a great creation. They're essentially, they are like tribbles from Star Trek, but even more ferocious and fearsome. And Brian himself had a really big, giant heart. And I think that definitely comes across in this film's screenplay. And that's another reason why this film is so endearing. It's another reason why this film is one of those movies where it garnered a massive fan base upon its release and still continues to garner new fans to this day. It's one of those movies that really does have that warm and comforting heart to it, despite the fact that it's got some scary, creepy subject material. It was the perfect gateway sci-fi horror film for young audiences. And I still think it's one of the best PG-13 sci-fi horrors out there because of how well the screenplay is done in terms of its sense of humor, in terms of the horror elements, in terms of the characters. They're all likable in one way or another. Some don't have as much character development, but there's enough there. There's some really unique stuff in the screenplay. The bounty hunters, and in particular, how they create their disguises. The the uh, the references and the meta stuff that's in the screenplay, the whole bit where the critters are looking at a stuffed doll of ET and bite its head off, stuff like that, really does make this screenplay stand out from the average B movie creature feature. And you could tell it was a labor of love for everyone involved, from Brian to Steven, and I am really thankful and I'm really glad that this film got made, and got made with the budget that it had, because initially it was going to be a Roger Corman film. Roger Corman was he had agreed to do Critters. He was gonna do a version of Brian's script, and it was gonna be a low budget Roger Corman production. But either Brian or Steven, I think it was Brian, he had a dinner set up with Bob Shaye of New Line, and he decided to just bring in the Critter script just because. And he had a little bit of a pitch to Bob, and Bob actually really liked it, and the rest was history. And Critters wound up being made by New Line instead of Roger Corman, so it had a little bit more money that they could put into the film. And I think that's why the Kyoto brothers were really able to go all out with this film, in terms of all of the different critters and the designs, and getting things like moose pelts for the critter designs, and the critter makeup and stuff like that. And also enabled them to polish and hone some more of the visual effects, and really do more of the screenplay than they might have been able to do with the much lower budget that was going to be with the Roger Corman film. And I definitely do feel the more money that New Line gave to this production really did pay off. And I don't feel the film would be as well received, or be as good as it is without that extra bit of money. And as a result, it's captured Brian Dominic Muir's legacy. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because Brian, he passed away at a very, very young age. He was in his 40s, and he passed away of cancer. Actually, I don't think it actually was cancer. He passed away of complications due to cancer. Even before he was writing the screenplay and stuff like that, he was battling cancer. He got cancer. I think it was lung cancer in his 20s, and he beat it. But then his cancer would come back, and then it would spread into his brain. And actually, after he died, the doctors said to his friends that he beat brain cancer. It was the other complications due to the treatments and everything, and all of that, and when the damage that had been done to his body at that point, that finally took him out. So honestly, Brian, you could tell this is a passion project of his, and so it's one of those things where it is really a wonderful thing that his legacy lives on through this film. And I just felt like I had to mention that in this video, because I just felt like I don't know. I just felt that there would be something missing if I didn't mention Brian. And in all honesty, there would be no Critters without Brian. So Brian is the one that is responsible for this concept and this idea, and ultimately this franchise. Now, the film features a really solid cast. You got Dee Wallace as Helen, the matriarch, the mother of the family. Dee Wallace delivers a movie performance in a B movie. and it's one of her best roles. I really like her performance. I think she nailed it, and she did a great job. Emmet Walsh is also in this as Sheriff Harv. It's a pretty nothing role, to be honest. I actually liked the performance of the other actor who played this character in the sequel more than Emmet Walsh here, but he did an okay job with what he was asked to do. Billy Green Bush plays the father, Jay, and he delivers a really nice sense of deadpan in terms of the line delivery to the overall film. I thought he played a nice straight man for the critter craziness. Scott Grimes is essentially the lead in this film as Brad Brown, and there's this certain charm to him, this boyish, punk kind of charm to this kid. Not in terms of like punk rock, but this was a kid that he had a little bit of an edge to him, kind of a Bart Simpson kind of character. Like he wasn't Opie Taylor by any means, and I think that definitely is a big reason why he was such a charismatic and memorable lead, is because he did a good job playing those type of roles. Those kids who there was something about them that, despite the fact that they were a little rough around the edges, they were still very likable, and didn't come across as some obnoxious jerk or anything like that. Because there are a lot of instances where you can have a character like that, and they can just come across as a really unruly and unlikable character. But that's not really the case with Brad. Um, Nadine Vandervelde, she plays April, the older sister. Essentially, she's the damsel in distress. She's the one that gets taken by the big critter by the end of the movie. She's there to scream her lungs out and have a little bit of a dynamic with her younger brother, where they kind of don't get along, but ultimately they rekindle, not necessarily, I'm not, that's probably the wrong word, but they bury the hatchet by the end of the movie. She had a certain toughness about her, though, that I really did like, and I think is a little bit understated when it comes to this particular performance and this character. Then you have Don Opper, who plays Charlie, and Charlie is the town drunk, but he has a certain amicable personality about him, despite the fact that he's the town drunk, the boy who cried critter, that kind of stuff. Well, actually, that ultimately was Brad. I got my terms mixed up, but he was the guy who would say all these crazy things, and everyone would be like, "Oh yeah, of course, all right, Charlie, you had too much to drink." But this time around, the messages that he was getting inside his feelings and everything actually had some truth to them. And he had some really good chemistry with Scott Grimes, and the two of them really worked well with one another. You also have Lin Shaye, who plays Sally, who works at the police station. She's a receptionist. Her performance in this and in the sequel is honestly some of my favorite roles from her, because it's totally different than what she would do for the most part later in her career. Yes, she would do a lot of horror films, but she would always play the same kind of character, the weird creepy old lady. Like that's what she would be typecast as. And here she is actually doing, in a lot of ways, kind of a homage to a 40s 50s kind of character. Even has some Lucille Ball kind of traits. And for the longest time, I didn't even know it was Lin Shaye, because she's really unrecognizable in this role compared to what she is known for today. So it's really refreshing to see her do a role like this. Billy Zane is also in this, in one of his first roles as April's boyfriend, Steve. You can see why he would go on to have a much bigger career, because even in this little bit of a role that he had a certain it factor to him. You also have Terrence Mann, who plays Ugg, and Johnny Steele, the rock singer. Terrence Mann This was his first film that he ever did. Before this, he had done a lot of work for Broadway. In fact, he was Rum Tug Tugger in Cats, and he was garnering a lot of acclaim for his Broadway work. And Terrence Mann is a really interesting exception to what is usually the rule with Broadway actors. A lot of Broadway actors don't want anything to do with the B movie creature feature. But Terrence Mann, he was all for it. He was into it. And I think a large part is because one of the producers was friends with him. They knew each other. And he reached out to Terrence, and Terrence was like, "Yeah, I'd love to do it." And he did it. And he also was the one that sang the vocals on the song Power of the Night, which is a classic. It's a great track. And Terrence Mann had fun with it, and you can tell. And it's a legitimately good performance for what he was asked to do, even though there's not a lot of acting involved. There's a lot of just looking serious, and it's more about a presence. But Terrence still did a really good job with that because the presence was believable. And Don also did a great job doing the dual role of playing Charlie as well as Charlie when Lee decides to take on the form of Charlie. And there were some other actors and actresses that were in the film, like Ethan Phillips, who played Jeff Barnes. But really, that's the main cast, and the main focus of the cast in terms of the characters is the family. And I really feel that the casting was great. Not only were the performances really solid, but they had great chemistry. You bought that they were a family, and that's something that looks easy in this film, but there's a lot of instances with films, especially of this type, where it doesn't really mesh as well as it could, or it doesn't at all. So this isn't one of those films where the family isn't believable. You buy that they are a family. You buy the bond that they have with one another, and that makes the suspense in the film when it does happen all the more effective. Uh, and speaking of suspense, I got to talk about the critters themselves because it's a creature feature, and ultimately, with a creature feature, the creatures or the creature is the star. And this film is no exception. The Kyoto brothers outdid themselves here with the critters. They did a amazing job creating these furry, ferocious fur balls. They had a certain cute sensibility to them, but then there was a believable ferocity to them that was genuinely kind of scary. Like, you didn't want to be in a dark room with these critters. You didn't want to be surrounded by them. And but at the same time, there was this tongue-in-cheek sensibility and vibe to them that really made them endearing in their own way. Particular stuff like the subtitles, which apparently Bob Shaye didn't like, didn't want to be in the movie, but I think it was either Brian or Steven or both who were like, no, we're going to do it anyway. And they did it. They had the subtitles for the sequence where the critter says fuck at a test screening, and it went over like gangbusters. The audience was howling, and Bob changed his mind and he loved it so much he wanted more. So that's an example of do what you want. Like, even if a producer is like, "Hey, I don't like this." If you're a filmmaker, and you have the power to do it, do it. Like, what do you have to lose? And so yeah, and that scene is really a great sequence. I still crack up at that scene. It's great. But yeah, the Kyoto brothers were in fine form here with their creature effects, and they used a lot of ingenuity, which is their hallmark. The stuff that they were able to do with such a low budget is absolutely remarkable, and it's just one of those things where this film wouldn't work without these critters. I mean, you had a big critter at the end that was fairly well done, but at the same time, I'm glad they didn't use it that much because you can tell it's a man in a suit, kind of has this Big Bird, Sesame Street character kind of vibe. If they focused on that too much, but they didn't. Thankfully, they shot it very sparingly, and it wasn't in the film much because, in all honesty, the critters work best as smaller fur balls of terror than they do as like some giant big man in a suit. But yeah, and also it was the Kyoto Brothers' first big film production where they did all the effects. So there's a lot of firsts in this film. It's a first film for the director. It's a first film for Terrence Mann. It's the first film for the Kyoto Brothers in terms of doing all of the effects work. And despite it being a series of firsts, they all got high marks. So it's one of those films that easily could have had a stumbling block or two, but it never really had one. And the ending for the film was actually different. The ending was a little bit darker. Their home gets blown up by the critters, the mischievous little beasts that they are. They just decide to essentially screw over the Browns by blowing up their house. And in the original ending, their house was still blown up and they had no home to go to. But that did not go over well with test audiences. So New Line ended up providing some more capital, and there were reshoots done, and that's where you have the ending that we have today, which is with the house being put back together by Ugg and Lee through magic space technology. And it's kind of out there, but it's an out there movie, and honestly, the ending works, and it's unique, and it's a great looking effect. So it's one of those instances where there was a reshoot that was done, and it was for the benefit of the film. Other elements of the film that are worth mentioning are definitely the score by David Newman. I'm not a super big fan of the entirety of the score. I think it suffers from a lack of memorability or really anything that elevates certain sequences. But at the same time, there was one track in particular that I really like, the Critter Skitter, which just it fits the critters like a glove, and it's a great bit of 80s synth. So that's why I wanted to mention this score, because I don't feel it's one of David Newman's best, but the Critter Skitter is one of my favorite pieces that he's done. So I definitely wanted to mention that. And I've already mentioned Power of the Night. It's a great 80s soundtrack track of glorious 80s awesomeness. And then you also have some other tracks like Shea Zuro's No Turning Back, which is another good one. David Newman, I'm not going to be too hard on him, though, because he did this script. I mean, not script. He did this score in a very short amount of time. It was a really rushed score. David Newman put this together with a small crew in a very short amount of time. So I'm not going to be too hard on him considering the circumstances. It features some really nice, gorgeous cinematography by Tim Scherstedt. It's one of those films that really does benefit from a sure hand. And in particular, the sequences that take place in Grover's Bend really do have this nice warm tone and look and feel to them. And then when there's sequences that need to have a more sinister look to them, he also does an equally spectacular job. The sequences are shot at night, the sequences shot inside dark rooms or in the home when the lights are off. Just overall a really good job in terms of the cinematography. The editing is very excellent and tight by Larry Bach, who was a multi-year veteran by the time he did this film, and it definitely does show. And the movie's only like 85 minutes, and it goes by at a really quick pace. Once it gets rolling, it really gets that ball rolling. And it's one of the better films of its type in terms of its pacing. The film would go on to be a surprise hit for New Line. It was only made for like $3 million, and it ultimately made around $13 million. So it definitely did make a profit, but it made most of its money in the home video market. And it's a film that a lot of horror fans my age or a little bit older grew up with, and I could totally understand why. Like I said earlier in this video, Critters is the perfect gateway sci-fi horror film for younger audiences. So I can see why a lot of people have a lot of fond memories associated with this film, and I can see why it still holds up. And it's a movie that, in all honesty, I wasn't super big on when I first saw it on VHS, but over the years, I've really developed a taste for it. And Siskel and Ebert loved it. They gave it both thumbs up, and it's a film that is definitely one of the best of its type. It's a fast, furry, funky, ferocious, fun movie, and I definitely would recommend it if you haven't seen Critters. And I absolutely would 100% recommend this Blu-ray too, because this is a great Blu-ray. You have a really nice looking 2K remaster. You have a really great feature-length documentary on the making of the film. It's a bummer that Scott Grimes is actually not featured in any of the documentaries that are from this box set, even though his name is on the back of the Blu-ray. But I gotta give him. I still really like Scott Grimes. It's just a bummer that he actually wasn't involved with the features for this set. But you still have some interviews with Dee Wallace. You got Don Opper. You got Terrence Mann, Lin Shaye, the producer Barry Opper, the Kyoto brothers. You also have a very heartfelt and really wonderfully created and well-made tribute to Brian Dominic Muir, the screenwriter, and the original ending and trailers, TV spots, and some behind-the-scenes footage, Critters footage from the Kyoto brothers. So yeah, definitely worth getting for your collection if you're a fan of these Critters films. If you're a fan of the Critters films, you already have the Blu-ray set. I probably don't really need to say much. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Critters. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you later. See ya.